The glass caught the light before she did. It always did. A thin line of gold across the rim, untouched. Daniel Whitmore sat alone this time. No partners. No audience. The same table. The same hour. His watch rested beside his hand, face down. He hadn't checked it once. The door opened with a soft chime. Emily stepped in, tying the final knot of her apron as she walked. Same pace. Same silence. But tonight she paused. Just slightly. As if she already knew. He didn't look up immediately. Not like before. His fingers traced the edge of the untouched glass, then stopped. When he finally raised his eyes, there was no challenge in them. No game waiting behind the question. Just a space. She approached, setting a napkin down with precise care. Not a word. Not yet. He reached into his jacket. Pulled out a card. The same kind he used to slide across tables like a test. He placed it down. Between them. Then, slowly, he turned it over. Blank side up. His hand stayed there for a moment longer than necessary. Not pushing it forward. Not offering. Just leaving it. Emily glanced at it. Only for a second. Then her eyes moved past it, to the glass. She lifted it, replaced it with a fresh one. The movement was clean. Quiet. Intentional. The old glass, still half full, disappeared into her tray without a sound. He noticed. Of course he did. That was the point. When she turned to leave, he spoke. Not a deal. Not a question. Just her name. Emily. She stopped. Didn't turn around immediately. When she did, it was slow. Measured. Like everything else she chose to do. He hesitated. For the first time, words didn't come ready. I was wrong, he said. Not louder than the room. Not softer than the truth. She held his gaze. Just long enough to let the moment settle. Then she nodded. Once. No smile. No forgiveness offered. But no distance either. Just acknowledgement. And then she walked away. No rush. No wait. Behind her, Daniel picked up the card. Turned it back over. The blank side stayed facing up. He slid it back into his pocket without looking at it again. The watch remained face down. The table stayed quiet. And for the first time in years he didn't try to fill it. Because some answers aren't given, they're understood. Answer this right, and I'll change your life, he said without looking up, his voice smooth, practiced, already bored with the outcome he expected, the kind of sentence that had opened doors, closed deals, and reduced people to quiet nods more times than he could count. And across the table Emily Carter didn't move, didn't react, didn't even glance at the black card he had just slid across the polished surface like it was nothing more than another piece of silverware. Because to her it was. Just another object placed in front of her during a 12-hour shift that smelled like roasted coffee beans and expensive cologne, the kind of place where men like Daniel Whitmore came to feel important and left expecting the world to agree, the overhead lights catching the edge of his Swiss watch as he finally lifted his gaze, expecting hesitation, curiosity, maybe even gratitude. But what he saw instead made him pause for half a second longer than he intended, because she wasn't looking at him the way people usually did. There was no flicker of calculation, no quiet attempt to read his mood or match his tone, just a calm, steady presence, the kind that didn't rush to fill silence, and for a moment the restaurant noise seemed to shift around them, glasses clinking, low conversations blending into a soft hum, while she finished setting down the last plate at a nearby table before returning to his, movements precise. Efficient, like she had done this 1,000 times without ever needing to think about it. You didn't hear me, he added, tapping the card once with his finger, a subtle reminder of who he was, what he represented, the invisible weight behind a simple piece of plastic, and still she didn't reach for it, didn't even look down. Instead she picked up the water glass beside him, noticed a faint smudge near the rim, and replaced it with a clean one in a single smooth motion, setting it down exactly where it had been as if nothing had changed. Except Everything had, because now he was watching her more closely, the slight narrowing of his eyes betraying something unfamiliar, interest, maybe, or irritation at not being immediately understood. It's a simple deal, he continued, leaning back slightly, giving the impression of ease while measuring her reaction. I ask a question. You answer it right, and I make it worth your time. The words hanging there between them, polished, controlled, designed to sound generous without ever needing to be, but Emily only nodded once, not in agreement, not in submission, just acknowledgement, like she had heard the sentence and placed it exactly where it belonged, somewhere unimportant, and when she finally spoke, her voice was even, quiet enough that he had to listen, not loud enough to draw attention. What's the question, she said, not as a challenge, not as acceptance, just a simple request for information, and something about the way she said it, the absence of urgency, the lack of performance, made the air between them feel different, like the rules he was used to no longer applied, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore didn't immediately smile. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward just slightly, enough for the light above to catch the edge of his cufflinks, enough to signal that whatever came next mattered, at least to him, and yet his tone stayed casual, almost dismissive, like a man who had already decided the outcome before the game had even begun. If you had $1 million to invest today, he said, fingers loosely resting near the untouched card, where would you put it and why? A question he had asked before in different rooms. To different people, always with the same quiet expectation that they would stumble, hesitate, try to impress him with words they barely understood. But Emily did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because she did not rush, her eyes briefly shifting past him to scan the rest of the dining room, noting a couple waiting for their check, another table signaling for more water. Her world still moving at the pace of responsibility rather than performance, and only when she had placed each detail in order did she bring her attention back to him, calm, steady, unhurried. That depends, she said, her voice soft but clear, and the two words landed differently than he expected, not as a delay, not as uncertainty, but as a quiet refusal to play by his timing. Daniel's brow tightened just enough to notice, because most people filled silence when he asked a question, most people tried to prove they were worth his attention, but she did not, she simply stood there. One hand resting lightly against the back of the chair beside her, posture relaxed, as if the weight of his question had not reached her at all. On what? He asked, the edge in his voice returning, not sharp, but present, and she met it without resistance. On whether the goal is growth or control, she replied, and this time she did not elaborate, did not rush to justify, she let the sentence sit between them, complete on its own, and something in Daniel's expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, because the answer was not wrong, not even close, but it was not what he had expected. It was not the kind of rehearsed breakdown he usually heard. It was precise, almost inconveniently so, forcing him to engage rather than evaluate. Assume both, he said after a moment, leaning back again, trying to regain the rhythm he was used to, the dynamic where he led and others followed. Growth and control, he repeated, as if narrowing the parameters would make the game easier to manage, but Emily only nodded once, acknowledging the condition without reacting to the tone behind it, and when she spoke again, it was with the same measured clarity. Then I would not start with the money, she said, and for the first time Daniel did not interrupt, did not redirect, he simply watched, waiting, because now there was something else in the air, something quieter, something he could not immediately name, and as she continued, there was no performance in her voice, no attempt to impress, just a steady unfolding of thought. I would start with the risk you are trying to avoid, she added, and the words did not come faster, did not rise or fall for effect, they just landed, one after the other, and Daniel felt it before he fully understood it, that faint, unfamiliar shift, like the ground beneath a conversation had moved just slightly out of place, and for a brief second, he forgot to respond. Daniel Whitmore did not answer immediately, and that alone shifted something in the air, because silence from him was never accidental, it was usually calculated, deliberate, used as a tool to make others fill the space. But this time the silence stayed, unclaimed, as his fingers tapped once against the table before stopping, as if even that habit no longer fit the moment. "The risk I am trying to avoid," he repeated slowly, not mocking, not dismissing, but testing the weight of her words, and Emily did not rush to clarify, did not lean in, did not adjust her tone to guide him. She simply stood there, steady, present, allowing him to sit inside the question instead of escaping it. And across the room someone laughed softly, a glass clinked, a server passed behind her carrying a tray of plates. Life continuing as if nothing unusual was happening, and yet at this table, something had already begun to tilt. Most people would start with allocation. Daniel continued after a moment, his voice lower now, less performative. "Percentages, sectors, timing," he added, as if reminding both of them of the usual rules, and Emily nodded once, acknowledging the pattern without agreeing to follow it. "Most people are trying to be right," she said, her voice unchanged. "They build answers that sound complete." And again she stopped there, not finishing the thought for him. Not turning it into a lesson, just placing it in front of him like a piece of information he could take or leave, and Daniel felt it again, that quiet disruption, because he knew exactly what she meant. He had heard those answers before, polished, confident, empty in the way that only rehearsed certainty could be, and for a second he saw himself from the outside, sitting at this table, offering questions not to learn but to confirm what he already believed, and the realization did not come with embarrassment, it came with something quieter, something sharper, recognition. "And you are not trying to be right," he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement he was still figuring out, and Emily's gaze held his for just a fraction longer this time, not confrontational, not soft, just direct. "No," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no need to soften the edge, because there was no edge to soften, just clarity, and Daniel leaned back again, but this time it was different, not the relaxed posture of control, but the slight shift of someone adjusting to a new position, a new dynamic he had not chosen. "So what would you do?" he asked, and now the question was not a test, not entirely, there was something else underneath it, something closer to curiosity, and Emily reached for the empty water glass. Again, aligning it slightly with the edge of the table before speaking, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but precise, intentional. "I would identify the assumption that makes the risk invisible," she said, and Daniel's eyes narrowed, not in skepticism, but in focus, because that was not an answer you could dismiss, it was not even an answer you could easily respond to, it was a mirror, and for the first time that evening, he was not entirely sure what it would show him if he looked too closely. Daniel did not look away this time, not when the words settled, not when the silence stretched just a second longer than what most people would tolerate, because something in what she said refused to be ignored. It did not demand attention, it simply held it, and his fingers, which had been resting near the card, slowly pulled back, as if the object had lost its purpose without him realizing it. "Invisible to who?" he asked, and the question came quieter than before, stripped of the usual edge. Not because he intended it that way, but because the moment did not allow anything louder, and Emily shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not leaning in, just adjusting, her presence unchanged, steady, grounded. "To the person who benefits from it," she replied, and again she did not elaborate, she did not build the answer into something impressive, she left it exactly where it needed to be, and Daniel felt a faint tightening in his chest, not discomfort exactly, but the subtle awareness of being seen in a way he had not agreed to, because he understood the implication immediately, not as a theory, but as something uncomfortably specific, and for a brief moment his gaze dropped to the table, to the reflection of the overhead light on the polished surface, before returning to her, slower this time, more deliberate. "You are assuming I am missing something," he said, and the words sounded more like a statement than a defense, but the space between them carried something else, something closer to curiosity than resistance, and Emily's expression did not change, not even slightly. "Everyone is," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no emphasis, just a simple acknowledgement of something universal, and that was what made it land, because she had not singled him out, had not challenged him directly, she had removed the idea that he was different, and in doing so, she had taken away the one position he was used to standing on, the one where he controlled the frame of every conversation, and for the first time since he had sat down, Daniel did not immediately move forward, did not push the discussion into the next phase. He stayed where he was, letting the thought settle, turning it over without speaking. And the restaurant continued around them, unnoticed, as if the world had shifted just enough to make everything else irrelevant. "Then what is the assumption?" he asked after a moment, and now the question was different, not a test, not a trap, but a request, quiet, almost reluctant, and Emily glanced down at the table, not at the card, not at his watch, but at the space between them, as if measuring something invisible before answering, and when she spoke, her voice remained the same, calm, unforced. "That control comes from having the answer first," she said, and the sentence did not rise, did not fall, it simply existed, and Daniel felt it before he could respond, the subtle shift of something he had always believed being placed just slightly out of alignment, because he had built everything on that idea, the certainty, the speed, the ability to move before anyone else did, and now, for the first time, someone had questioned it without trying to take it away, without even trying to win. And that was what made it different, that was what made it stay, and for a brief second, Daniel Whitmore did not know what to say next. Daniel's hand moved again, but this time it did not reach for the card, it hovered just above the table, as if the habit had not yet caught up with the shift in his thinking, and then slowly, almost unconsciously, it pulled back, resting instead beside the untouched glass, his posture no longer arranged for effect, no longer projecting certainty, just present, and that alone changed the space between them. Because presence did not require control, it required attention, and for the first time that evening, he was giving it without expecting something in return. "If control does not come from having the answer first," he said, his voice quieter now, less defined by authority and more by thought, "then where does it come from?" And the question lingered, not as a challenge, but as something unfinished, something he was still holding in his own mind, and Emily did not respond immediately, not because she needed time, but because she chose it, her gaze shifting briefly toward a table across the room where a man had just raised his hand slightly, signaling for the check, a small, ordinary detail that she registered without breaking the moment. And then she looked back at Daniel, steady as before, unchanged by his tone, unchanged by the subtle shift that had taken place. "From knowing what you are willing to be wrong about," she said, and the sentence landed with a quiet weight, not heavy, not forced, but undeniable, because it did not argue with him, it did not oppose him, it simply introduced a condition he had never needed to consider, and Daniel felt it settle, not all at once, but in layers, the way certain truths did, slowly replacing the space where certainty used to sit, and for a second his jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in recognition, because being wrong had never been part of the framework he operated in, not publicly, not visibly, not in a way that allowed others to see it, and yet here it was, not as a weakness, but as a form of control he had never explored. "That is not how this works," he said after a moment, but the words lacked conviction, as if they were spoken out of habit rather than belief, and Emily did not argue, did not correct him, she simply adjusted the fork at the edge of the table, aligning it with the plate in a motion so precise it almost felt symbolic, and then she spoke again, her voice unchanged, calm, measured. "It is not how it looks," she said, and there was something different in that phrasing, not disagreement, not correction, but distinction, and Daniel's eyes followed the movement of her hand for just a fraction longer than necessary, noticing the detail, the intention, the quiet control in something as simple as placing a fork exactly where it belonged, and it stayed with him longer than it should have, because it mirrored something he was just beginning to understand, that control was not always loud, not always visible, not always tied to having the first answer, and as the realization began to take shape, subtle and incomplete, he found himself not reaching for the next question, not pushing the conversation forward, but staying in it, letting it unfold without direction, without urgency, and in that stillness, something unfamiliar settled into place, not certainty, not yet, but something quieter, something he could not name, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore was not trying to win the conversation. Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, not out of impatience, but as if something inside him had shifted just enough to make breathing feel different, and his eyes dropped briefly to the table again, not searching for an answer, not calculating, just observing, the faint reflection of light, the precise alignment of the fork she had adjusted, the untouched card still sitting where he had placed it. And for the first time he noticed how unnecessary it looked, how out of place it felt in a moment that no longer needed it, and when he looked back up at Emily, there was no trace of the earlier challenge in his expression, no attempt to regain control of the conversation, just a quiet focus. "You are not answering the question the way I expected," he said, and the words carried no accusation, only recognition, and Emily's response was immediate but unforced. "I am not answering the question you asked," she said, and there was something almost imperceptible in the way she said it. Not defiance, not correction, just clarity, and Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, processing the distinction, because he understood exactly what she meant. Even if he had never framed it that way before, he had asked about money, about strategy, about something measurable, and she had responded with something else entirely, something that could not be reduced to numbers or percentages. And that was what unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it was not something he could immediately use, and for a moment he almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, the kind that came when something familiar was suddenly seen from a different angle. "Then what question are you answering?" he asked, and this time the tone was different again, softer, less defined by expectation, and Emily's eyes did not shift, did not search for the right phrasing, they stayed exactly where they were, steady, present. "The one behind it," she said, and the simplicity of the answer made it land harder than anything else she had said so far, because it removed the surface entirely, left only the intention underneath, and Daniel leaned back slightly, not to distance himself, but to take in the space between them, as if seeing it more clearly now, not as a table, not as a setting, but as a place where something had changed. And for a brief second he glanced at the card again, the object that had started this, the symbol of every conversation he had controlled before, and without thinking, he reached for it, but instead of sliding it forward, instead of reinforcing its purpose, he turned it slightly, just enough to break its alignment with the edge of the table, a small movement, almost meaningless on its own, and yet it marked something, a shift so subtle it could easily be missed, but it was there, and Emily noticed, not with her eyes, not directly, but in the way her posture remained unchanged, as if she had expected nothing else, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm as before. "If you want an answer that works," she said, "you have to decide what you are actually asking." And Daniel did not respond right away, not because he could not, but because for the first time, he was not sure he wanted to answer too quickly, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time, the space between knowing and understanding, and he stayed there, just for a moment longer than usual, letting it exist. Daniel did not speak right away, and this time the silence did not feel like a pause between moves, it felt like the absence of them, as if the need to respond had quietly stepped aside, leaving something else in its place, and his gaze drifted, not away from her, but through the space between them, taking in details he would have ignored before, the faint reflection of the overhead lights on the polished table, the way the edges of the silverware lined up with quiet precision, the low hum of conversations that no longer felt like background noise but part of a world that did not revolve around him, and when he finally moved, it was slower than before, his hand reaching for the glass she had replaced earlier, lifting it slightly, noticing the weight, the balance, the absence of the smudge that had been there before, and for a moment he held it without drinking, as if recognizing something in the gesture itself, the small, intentional correction that had not asked for attention, had not needed acknowledgement, and he set it back down gently, more carefully than necessary. "You do not rush," he said, not as a question, not as an observation meant to lead somewhere, just a statement that had arrived on its own, and Emily's response was a slight shift of her gaze, not toward him, not away, just enough to acknowledge the words without giving them more weight than they needed. "There is no reason to," she said, and the simplicity of it settled into the space like everything else she had offered, unforced, complete, and Daniel let out a quiet breath, not a sigh, not release, just the natural rhythm of someone who had stopped holding something without realizing it, and for the first time he leaned forward without purpose, without a strategy behind the movement, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his hands no longer positioned to signal control, just placed there, open, unguarded in a way that would have felt unfamiliar hours ago. Most people would have taken the card, he said, glancing at it briefly, the corner now slightly misaligned, the edge no longer parallel with the table, as if even it had lost its place, and Emily followed his glance only for a fraction of a second before returning her focus to the space in front of her, not to him, not to the object, just to the moment itself. Most people think they are being offered something, she replied, and again she stopped there, allowing the sentence to exist without explanation, and Daniel felt the meaning unfold without needing her to finish it, because he knew what she had left unsaid, that an offer was only valuable if it changed something that mattered, and for her, it had not, and the realization did not sting, it did not challenge him, it simply settled, reshaping the way the entire interaction had been framed from the beginning, and for a brief second, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, not from amusement, but from the quiet recognition of a pattern breaking. "And you did not," he said, more to himself than to her, and Emily's answer came just as evenly as before. "I did not need to." And there was no pride in it, no distance, just a statement that carried its own weight without asking to be believed, and Daniel nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it stayed, it lingered longer than any of his earlier gestures, because it was not meant to direct anything, it was simply there. An acknowledgement without control, without expectation, and as the moment settled into something quieter, something more still, he realized he had stopped trying to steer it entirely. And for the first time in a long time, that did not feel like losing. Daniel's gaze lingered on the table a moment longer, not searching, not measuring, just staying, and that alone felt unfamiliar, because staying had never been part of how he moved through conversations. He moved forward, redirected, concluded, but now there was no urgency to do any of those things, and the space between him and Emily no longer felt like something to control, it felt like something to understand. And when he finally looked up again, there was no calculation in his eyes, no quiet strategy forming behind them, just a clarity that had not been there before. "So the deal was never the point," he said, not as a realization he needed confirmed, but as something he had already accepted, and Emily did not answer immediately, not because she disagreed, but because the statement did not require a response, and instead she reached for the edge of the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface as she straightened a napkin that had shifted slightly out of place. A small correction, almost invisible, but precise, intentional, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet steadiness. "It was for you," she said, and Daniel nodded once, slower than before, because now he understood what she meant, not in theory, not as an idea, but as something he had just experienced, the need to test, to measure, to confirm. None of it had been about her, it had been about maintaining a position he no longer felt the need to hold, and his hand moved again. But this time it reached for the card without hesitation, lifting it from the table, turning it once between his fingers as if seeing it differently, not as leverage, not as an offer, just as an object that no longer carried the same weight, and for a moment he considered placing it back, resetting the dynamic, restoring the familiar structure, but the thought passed just as quickly as it came, and instead he slid it toward himself, not across the table, not toward her. Just enough to remove it from the space between them, and the movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it changed something, it cleared the space, left nothing there that needed to be accepted or refused, and Emily's gaze did not follow the card, did not react to the gesture, she simply remained where she was, steady, unchanged, as if the removal of it had been expected all along, and the absence of it made the moment quieter, cleaner, more honest in a way that did not need to be explained. "What would you do now?" Daniel asked after a moment, and the question was different. From the first, not framed as a test, not tied to an outcome, just a simple request, and Emily looked at him for a second longer than before, not searching, not evaluating, just seeing, and then her gaze shifted past him, toward the dining room, toward the other tables, the other responsibilities that had never stopped existing while this conversation unfolded, and when she spoke, it was with the same calm certainty. "Finish what I started," she said, and there was no emphasis, no hidden meaning, just a statement of action, and Daniel followed her gaze briefly, noticing for the first time the small details he had ignored when he arrived, the quiet rhythm of the room, the subtle movements that kept everything in place without drawing attention, and when he looked back, she was already turning, already moving away, not abruptly, not dramatically, just continuing, and he did not call her back. Did not add anything more, because there was nothing left to ask, and as he sat there, the table in front of him clear, the card now resting in his own hand instead of between them, he realized something had shifted in a way that did not need to be named, something quiet, something complete, and for the first time that evening, he let the moment end without trying to extend it. The restaurant did not change when she walked away, but something in the space she left behind did, subtle, almost invisible, like a note that had been playing quietly in the background and then stopped, leaving the silence more noticeable than the sound ever was, and Daniel remained seated, not reaching for his phone, not checking the time, not signaling for anything, his hand resting lightly on the table where the card had been. His fingers no longer tapping, no longer measuring the seconds. Just still, and across the room Emily moved the same way she always had, steady, precise, present in each small action, refilling a glass before it was asked for, adjusting a plate before it was noticed, never drawing attention, never needing to, and yet now, he saw it, not as routine, not as background, but as something deliberate, something chosen. And his eyes followed her for a moment longer than he intended before lowering again to the table, to the clean line where the card had once separated them, and without thinking, he reached into his pocket, pulled it out once more, turned it between his fingers, then placed it down again, not in the center, not offered, just set beside his glass, aligned carefully with the edge of the table the way she had aligned everything else, and when the check arrived, he did not open it right away, he simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. And when Emily returned, she did not ask if everything was fine, did not wait for a response, she placed the receipt down with the same calm precision and turned to leave. But this time, just before she stepped away, he spoke, not to stop her, not to restart anything, just her name, soft, almost lost in the room, and she paused, only for a second, her hand resting lightly against the back of the chair beside her, and when she turned, there was no expectation in her eyes, no question waiting, just presence. And Daniel held her gaze, not searching, not testing, just holding it. And then he gave the smallest nod, a gesture so simple it could have meant anything, but it did not ask for anything in return, and she answered it the same way, a quiet nod of her own, equal, measured, complete, and then she walked on, the rhythm of her steps unchanged, disappearing back into the flow of the room, and Daniel remained there a moment longer, the noise of the restaurant settling back around him, familiar again, but different in a way he could not quite name, and when he finally stood, he did not rush, did not look back, he simply adjusted his jacket, left the card where it was beside the glass, untouched, and walked out into the night without checking his watch. Because some things do not need to be proven once they are understood.